Can you imagine being told you have two life-threatening conditions and the cure for one is impossible because of the other? Well, for decades, that was the grim reality for people with both HIV and kidney failure. But that story, thankfully, has been completely rewritten. Today, we're diving into the incredible medical journey of how kidney transplants have opened up a new era of hope. And it's really hard to overstate just how bleak the outlook was. In the early days of the epidemic, HIV was a fatal disease, full stop. The idea of performing a massive surgery like an organ transplant on someone whose immune system was already under attack, it just wasn't on the table. For doctors, it was simply unthinkable. So, what changed? Well, the entire revolution kicked off in the mid-1990s with the arrival of effective antiretroviral therapy, or ART. These drugs were an absolute game changer. They transformed HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. All of a sudden, people with HIV were living longer, healthier lives. And that incredible medical leap is what paved the way for the 2013 HOPE Act in the US, which finally, formally, opened the door for people with HIV to get the life-saving organ transplants they needed. Which, of course, brings us to the most important question of all. Now that these transplants are actually happening, just how well do they work? To figure that out, we're going to dig into the best, most comprehensive data out there. Now, the data we're about to look at is incredibly powerful. This isn't just from one little study, it's from what's called a systematic review and meta-analysis. Basically, researchers gathered up the results from 49 different studies covering this massive group of over 6,100 patients. When you combine data like that, you get the clearest possible picture of what's really going on. So, this is the core of it, right? The central comparison. If we put the results side by side, how do the outcomes for kidney transplant patients with HIV stack up against patients who are HIV-negative? Let's break down the survival scorecard. We're going to look at three really critical things here. First, the survival of the patient themselves. Second, the survival of the new kidney, what's called the graft. And third, the rate of organ rejection. Okay, so here's the headline right up front. In the short term, we're talking the first few years after the transplant, the news is just fantastic. The survival outcomes are remarkably similar for patients with and without HIV. And that is a monumental achievement. But as time goes on, a gap starts to appear and the long-term challenges become a lot clearer. Let's start with that amazing news. 1 year after getting a new kidney, the patient's survival rate for people with HIV is an incredible 94%. And to put that in perspective, that's nearly identical to the rate for recipients without HIV. This is the number that proves this procedure isn't just possible, it's safe and really effective, at least in the short term. But what happens after that first year? Well, the data shows that once you get beyond 5 years, the survival rate for patients with HIV dips down to 83%. Now, that's still a really strong outcome, but the analysis is clear. The survival risk for people with HIV becomes significantly higher compared to their HIV-negative peers in the long run. Next up, let's look at the kidney itself, the graft. It's one thing for the patient to survive, but does the new organ actually keep working? Well, at the 1-year mark, the graft survival rate is 90%. Again, a really strong, promising number that shows the immediate success of these transplants. But this is where the drop-off is a bit steeper. After 5 years, that 90% rate falls to 71%. The data shows that the risk to the new kidney is actually higher for people with HIV right from the start, and that gap just keeps widening over time. So why is that happening? Well, a major reason is organ rejection. At 1 year after the transplant, the rejection rate for people with HIV is 26%. And after 5 years, that rate climbs all the way to 39%. These rates are consistently higher than what we see in HIV-negative patients, and that poses a huge challenge to long-term success. This brings us to the next logical question. If we know what the challenges are, what can we actually do about them? Let's dive into the key factors that can make a real difference in whether these transplants succeed or fail. And it turns out, one of the most critical factors is the patient's specific HIV medication plan. Yep. The very drugs they take to control the virus play a massive role in the success of the transplant. And the findings here are super specific. The analysis found a clear connection. Avoiding a class of HIV drugs called protease inhibitors led to better kidney survival. Why? Well, it's because those specific drugs can have some really tough interactions with the anti-rejection meds that are absolutely essential after a transplant. It creates a difficult balancing act. On the flip side, patients who kept their viral load undetectable after surgery had a much lower risk of rejection. It just proves how vital consistent, optimized HIV care is. The research also flagged another huge risk factor: co-infections. To be specific, being co-infected with hepatitis C had a significant negative impact on the new kidney's survival, both in the short term and the long term. This really complicates things for the patient and, unfortunately, worsens the overall prognosis. All right, so after looking at all this data, the wins, the challenges, the risk factors, what's the final verdict? And maybe more importantly, what's next for patients and doctors in this field? So, after weighing all the evidence, what is the ultimate takeaway? What's the final call on kidney transplants for people living with HIV? The verdict is clear, and it is overwhelmingly positive. Kidney transplantation is absolutely a viable option. It is a safe, effective, life-saving treatment for people with HIV. The fact that short-term outcomes are now pretty much the same as they are for the general population, that is a truly remarkable medical triumph. So what's the path forward from here? Well, the focus now really shifts to closing that long-term survival gap after the 5-year mark. That means optimizing ART treatments to be more transplant-friendly and being super aggressive about managing co-infections like hepatitis C. But there's a much bigger challenge here. The source material points out that while over 80% of people with HIV live in low and middle-income countries, only a tiny fraction of them can actually get these life-saving transplants. Tackling that global inequity has to be a top priority. Which leaves us with this one last crucial question. The science has been revolutionary. It's turned what was once a fatal disease into a chronic one. The challenge for all of us now is to figure out how we make sure that the benefits of that progress, the quality of a longer, healthier life, are truly available to everyone everywhere.